welcome everybody. In today's episode on the Sacred Wisdom podcast, we are going to discuss the flashes that have been sighted on the moon. NASA created a project that was called Project Moonlink in 1965 in the exploration for unusual phenomena or anomalies on the surface of the moon. But these flashes have been sighted throughout history and go back a very long way and are documented as well. And I'm joined with the amazing Stephen Denman today, my brother. How you doing, bro?
I'm doing very well indeed. I hope all's good with you.
All is super, my bro. And first and foremost, let's just discuss a little bit in regards to what these flashes might be. And what do you think these flashes are that are appearing on the moon?
I think they're connected to artificial structures. I think the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, and the European Space Agency, or the ESA, are fully aware of this. I think they're connected to different aspects of the secret space program, the SSP, perhaps some kind of alliance between Homo sapiens or human beings that have been selected and trained to be part of the secret space program, or the SSP, to work alongside various ultra-terrestrials and extraterrestrials in the further construction of various surface facilities or installations on the moon, and perhaps their navigation lights or their warning lights of some nature, or some kind of photonic communication that is used between various types of interstellar vehicles or spaceships. Again, it's all open for speculation, I'd say.
I agree with you, and I feel that too. I think they are very definitely something along them lines. But there was a time where there was described to be no moon in the sky. And so let's go back. So we're talking, you kind of go into detail on that, on the dates, but let's just go back to that period, the Arcadian period, right?
Yeah, so if we go back to the time of classic Greece, that's obviously incorporating both Greek mainland and the Greek islands in that area of the Mediterranean. There were various Greek scholars such as Aristarchus, Gezoristou, and Plutarchus Aristobulus, who became also known as Lucius Mestrius Plutarchus, that wrote very clearly about a group known as the Procelinus, which in the Greek language of these individuals who had existed before the time of the moon. Procelinus in the Greek language can translate into the lingua anglica, or the English language, as those that were before the moon. Now, these individuals are also known as the Procelinus, again, meaning those that were before the moon, who had existed in the Arcadia region of the southern Greek mainland. Now, this grouping of classical Greeks claims to have existed before the moon actually was placed into orbit around planet Earth. So we would be going back at least, I'd say, 17,500 BC. Now, obviously, that doesn't really tally up with what we know from the dating processes of Western science when it comes to the historical timelines or narratives of classic Greece. We also have to remember that these perceptions were also sort of complemented in a way, were reinforced in another way by Democritus Vathisou and Anaxagoras M. Vrithiou. They mention a time when there was no moon in orbit in the night skies, the curious skies above planet Earth that were once moonless. Hence, many generations of what then became known as the Deucalion Prototheos and the Pyrrha Prototheos never perceived the moon in the night sky. So it's believed that before the first Great Flood and the second Great Flood, again, when it comes to Greek folklore, that the moon did not exist in orbit around planet Earth. So I've got to put that question out there. Is there a connection between the first Great Flood, the second Great Flood, and the moon being brought into position, navigated from its original orbit around the planet Jupiter, and then being brought into this area, this location in the solar system, and put into orbit around planet Earth? It's a question. I'm just putting it out there. Very interesting to note.
I have always looked at the moon in the strangest way to know that it's something separate from this planet. It is always seen like I see it like an observation
Yeah,
deck. I've always seen it like that, and I think the ancients saw it like that as
that's
well to
right.
some level. Yeah, so
Oh, absolutely, they did indeed, and there are absolutely vast amounts of South American hieroglyphs found, for example, in the cityscape of Tiwanaku in western Bolivia that specifically record the moon entering into orbit around planet Earth anytime from 11,500 to 13,000 years ago. So we'd be looking at around 13,500 BC to 15,000 BC. So again,
wow.
it's sort of approximation. It tallies up again with the dates that other researchers have given of around 17,500 BC, being perhaps when the moon was brought into orbit around planet Earth. So I'll give or take a few centuries either side, but whichever is correct and which is not correct, it does seem that the moon was not always permanently in orbit around planet Earth, and certainly not for millions of years. It's interesting to also note, for example, that the Greek Middle Platonist and historian known as Plutarchus Aristobulus, he actually specifically wrote in his own book called Ethos, which in the Greek language can translate into morals in the English language. And he actually stated there were Arcadians of Evander's following, the so-called pre-lunar people. It's also interesting to note that the famous Roman poet known as Publius Ovidius Naso wrote, the Arcadians are said to have possessed their land before the birth of Zeus, and the folk is older than the moon.
Yeah, so it feels like it was almost like brought in. There was a regulation of this
That's
moon
right.
coming into orbit and regulate the tides, and obviously as well, the moon relates back as well with to the Native Americans, where they actually the females
Yeah,
would actually have their cycles, their monthly cycles, or
yeah,
with the full moon, and
that is correct.
obviously
Yeah, the
that's
lunar
complete.
cycles to do
That
with their
that
periods. Yeah.
what do you think on that as well? In the way that kind of
Well, that's
almost
the
goes.
whole
Mm,
cycle of menstruation, and the magnetic fields of the moon
mm.
interconnects to that biological aspect of females. Perhaps you can then postulate is connected to some part of the divine matriarchy, the
Mm.
Earth Mother, but also coastal attrition, tidal flow, and again you have the connotations of the waters of life, the oceans of life,
Mm.
and the idea of the water from the womb. So again, the earth mother, her fertile waters being interconnected to the moon. Also, the actual word lunar itself is connected to the divine matriarchy, to the idea of the goddess archetype.
Yes.
That's also interesting to note. We also have to remember that you have the Greek grammarian known as Stephanos Vasimosou, who also was known as Stephanos of Byzantium. He actually stated that Arcadians and females both exist before the moon, and the famous Christian theologian known as Hippolytus Metrifiou, and also more commonly known as Hippolytus of Rome, referred to a legend, and I quote, that Arcadia brought forth Pelagus of greater antiquity than the moon. So
Um,
what it's stating there is, in this perception from Hippolytus Metrifiou, also known as Hippolytus of Rome, is that there were these vast civilizations going back, before the time of the first great flood, the second great flood, that had existed and was so archaic. They were much older than when the moon itself was brought into orbit around planet Earth. So, and the amount of world mythology and world folklore is quite extensive when it comes to the idea that the moon has not really been a particularly long-term spherical body in orbit around planet Earth.
but you had the Colombian Indians, right? So
Yeah, the Colombian Indians that were known as the Chibchas and the Muisca refer really to a vast expanse of time, in this 3D holographic reality that we can define as the material dimension before the moon actually was in orbit. Now, the Chibchas and the Muisca are located in the Bogota highlands of the eastern Cordilleras and the Andean mountains of southern Colombia. And so they were living in very upward altitude areas. Obviously, there wasn't street light pollution or vast amounts of chemical pollutants from, the industrial age or the industrial revolution going back many, many aeons, where they had a very clear perception in the curious skies or the night skies around planet Earth, and they have very vivid racial memories of a time when the moon was not in orbit, and they get that is recorded in certain diagrams in a book called Vues de Cordilleros, meaning Views of the Mountain Chains, that was written and produced by Friedrich Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt, and was actually published on the 1st of October 1816. And in these
that's publicly available, is it, that book?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's out there in the public record. It's there available for any individual who's interested in this subject matter to go and look into and research. So, he clearly was really had an understanding of what the Chibchas and the Muisca, these different kinds of Colombian Indians, had recorded in their own racial memory, in their own pictorial diagrams, in their own sort of their own sense of South American tribalism of what they observed in the night skies. And the moon was not seen as anything that was visible. And we can see from the size of the moon now how, when you see the full moon, it's incredibly bright, it's incredibly visible. You couldn't miss something like that in the night skies. What's
your idea just on that point? What's your idea on the concept of the moon being 240,000 miles away? Do you think it?
I think that is pretty much correct. I think that the distance it is from planet Earth really isn't that relevant. The truth of what we need to understand is not how far in terms of kilometers or miles the orbit of the moon is from planet Earth. Just in my opinion, I'm not saying it isn't relevant to other individuals, but I think we need to understand the actual true historical narrative of what the moon is, where it really came from, and why is the moon far older than planet Earth, which makes absolutely no sense at all when we look at the actual ideas and concepts that are constantly being pumped out from Western science that we read about in New Scientist, we read about in Scientific American and Nature magazine, and the science supplements of the broadsheet newspapers, not just here in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, but in the United States of America, the Dominion of Canada, and across countries, for example, in parts of Europe. And it's really becoming very repetitive.
Yeah, we've reached breaking point, I think.
And the oversaturation of the whole UFO subject, therefore the subject of whether or not ultra-terrestrials and extraterrestrials are even visiting Earth or are consistently concealed away or are they're invisibly present here on planet Earth, which they have been and still are, and have been here for many thousands and thousands of years. And there are more than likely at least 4, if not 5 or 6 predominant kinds of ultra-terrestrials or extraterrestrials that have a very intensely close and covert relationship with the true historical narrative of planet Earth, and of course the moon, and what the moon really is and why it was brought into orbit around planet Earth. Now, so my screen's gone. Hang on, that's it. So I personally believe that the planet Earth was a water world before the moon was brought in. There wasn't tidal flow, coastal erosion. There wasn't estuarine areas. The kinds of aquatic ecosystems, I believe, are radically different. And I believe that individuals like Friedrich Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt and many others of his ilk from the Victorian period or the Victorian age became quite aware that what was emerging in Western science with, for example, the concepts of evolution were probably rather bogus, didn't really make a lot of sense, but were being, literally funded and put out there on a consistent basis. But when you look at the Colombian Indians, such as the Chibchas and the Muisca, in their homesteads, in those upward locations in the Bogota highlands of the Eastern Cordilleras and the Andean Mountains of southern Colombia.
Yeah.
Those individuals have an incredible racial memory in terms of their South American tribalism, and that was being orally and pictorially recorded over many, many centuries and aeons. And I think they are very reliable and credible individuals that should be taken seriously by academics from Western science when it comes to the idea that the moon wasn't in the long term in orbit around planet Earth.
These Colombian Indians, what was it they are actually quoting? Because they said some incredible words, didn't they, about there being no moon in the sky?
That's right. So it's known that Frederick Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt and Helen Maria Williams published a very interesting book called Researches Concerning the Institutions and Monuments of the Ancient Inhabitants of America on the 1st of January 1814. Now, on page 87 of that book, both those individuals mention how the Chibchas, who these Colombian Indians from the Eastern Cordillera in the Colombian Andes, actually remember how the nights used to be during the earliest times when the moon was not yet in the heavens. Now, we have to also note that in a separate book written by the German scholar called Hans Ruprecht Fischke, in his book called In Moderne Welt, that was published on the 18th of September 1930, he states on page 145 similar kind of sentiments. Basically, he kind of refers to the idea that the moon was not technically in the heavens in terms of the perceptions of these Colombian Indians. So he just basically reiterates what had already been published in Researches Concerning the Institutions and Monuments of the Ancient Inhabitants of America, that was written by Frederick Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt and Helen Maria Williams on the 1st of January 1814. So
right. But even in the Bible, Steve, sorry, just to say, even in the Bible, you had somebody as well, in the book of Job, right?
Yeah, that's right. In the book of Job in the Holy Bible, it is mentioned that the moon was not always present in the night sky. And it states in Job 25:5, behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not. Yea, the stars are not pure in his sight. So again, is that a contradiction with the book of Genesis? Again, that's open to speculation. We also learn that the moon did not seemingly orbit planet Earth, according to the book of Psalms in the Holy Bible. In Psalm 72:5, it states, thou wast fierce since the sun and before the moon, a generation of generations. Again, that seems to echo much of what these Greek scholars were referring to do with these Arcadians, the Procelinus, who are these individuals, these habitants that existed in the Greek mainland long before the moon was placed into orbit around planet Earth.
And then you had all this information, and then like I just mentioned as well before about John Joseph O'Neill, all these projects in the 50s. I believe Adolf Hitler or the Fourth Reich or the Third Reich, sorry, they actually knew about this as well. So I believe that happens. I think, and we've got constant information throughout history when we just look at it, kind of contradicting all the time the public version that we're given. You can see there is lots of other information that you can see on the other podcasts on the moon that fill all the gaps in this as well. So please take a look at them in the member section. But the moon is definitely, we feel, artificial, and there seems to be enough proof of that. So, but if it was proven to be artificial, what does that say about the origins of planet Earth? And that's what I think the real problem is we have here. And how everything's been created and how we've been given these narratives, and it just starts breaking down everything. So
that's right.
So what was before the moon, Steve? What do you think was before the moon existed? Why do you think it was brought in?
I think there's a number of speculative reasons we could discuss, maybe too many for this Sacred Wisdom podcast. I think it was for more than one particular reason. I think there were fully intentions made at some point by certain ultra-terrestrials or extraterrestrials. Some individuals will say they're perhaps the Orion Greys, the Tau Greys, the Greadans, and perhaps the Zeta Reticulum type A Greys, the Zeta Reticulum type B Greys. Perhaps the Nordic Pleiadians are involved on some level. Reptoids or some sort of reptilian hominids perhaps are involved. Again, these golden mantids that have been speculated about have been seen by many individuals who are alien contactees, predominantly in the United States of America and the Dominion of Canada, of course, not particularly in many other locations, perhaps in some, Latin America, in some parts of Latin America. But I would say it was perhaps to control human consciousness, maybe perhaps to do with the long-term spiritual evolution of Homo sapiens or human beings here on planet Earth, while they choose to incarnate in the 3D holographic reality of this material dimension. It could be also to do with creating specific, very long-term geographic and topographical alterations on planet Earth, a kind of slow terraforming process to do with gravitational influences on coastal regions, estuarine locations, to do with what's going on, for example, in the Arctic Ocean, the Norwegian Sea, the North Sea, the Irish Sea, Celtic Sea, the English Channel, the North Atlantic Ocean, the South Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and so on and so on. I think it's a multifaceted approach that these ultra-terrestrials have, whether they are existing in large numbers or not, on the surface of the dark side of the moon, in the subterranean reaches they have excavated out inside the moon, and perhaps in certain deep underground military bases, or DUMBs as they're called, or D1 bases, scattered in the subterranean reaches below the surface of planet Earth. Again, who knows, it could be that perhaps with the destruction that occurred with the planet Maldak exploding and becoming the main asteroid belt, the destruction of the atmosphere and the ecosystems on the planet Mars, there had to be some kind of mass evacuation, literally thousands and many aeons ago, going back into the misty reaches of space-time, in terms of conventionality that don't match what we're told by Western science, and they needed to terraform parts of planet Earth. I believe planet Earth was some kind of water world. I think it was possibly even ruled by some kind of aquatic hominids at one point. They may still exist in the deepest reaches and expanses of the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and elsewhere. Maybe that's connected to many aspects of world mythology and world folklore when it comes to aquatic supernatural life forms. Again, it's just open to speculation, but I think I don't think really much of the historical narratives were given are really correct. I think that they're a patchwork of some fact mixed with a lot of fiction. And it's designed by the powers that be, the policymakers, for control purposes, is to keep human consciousness moving in certain directions for their own financial gain, for their money, their profit, their wealth, their aggrandizement, and to keep Homo sapiens or human beings in a state of technosis where they're consistently in a trance-like collectivized focus in the 3D holographic reality of this material dimension, which really touches much on the work of, in terms of experientiality as soul personalities or soul beings here on planet Earth. We come here for these experiential interactions and to understand ourselves and to learn and to progress. And I think on that level, perhaps this is all part of a much longer term plan, whether it's consciously done or not, for humanity to progressively awaken to eventually embrace the different galactic councils or galactic federations, so we can head out there with a new space age beyond the confines of our own solar system into the Milky Way galaxy and beyond. But I don't think humanity's ready for that. I don't think most individual incarnate Homo sapiens or human beings are ready for that, let alone even the concepts of the 4D holographic reality of the astral plane or near-death experiences or the NDE phenomena. I really feel it's so far out there, because the level of conditioning that's gone on means if we were to know the reasons why the moon was brought into orbit around planet Earth, most individuals may have a nervous breakdown, suffer cognitive dissonance, like what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union in communist Russia, and all the and it or what happened at the end of World War II, when it came to an end on the 8th of May 1945. The level of collectivized trauma and severe mental health issues was incredibly vast. It was so severe. But we'd be looking at events around the moon, being exposed really for what it really is, and why it's really in orbit around planet Earth, whatever the reasons are, as being something that was excavated out, brought into our solar system by you navigating here by the use of a singularity, and then it was placed into orbit around the planet Jupiter. Then it was moved, into this part of the inner solar system around the planet Earth, and for whatever reason, the destruction of the planet Maldek, I think, is connected to that. And I think that's why we don't see Western science going on about the idea that perhaps the main asteroid belt really, effectively was a huge, spherical body in orbit around the sun. And the planet Maldek itself was also a water world. It was sometimes defined as the second sun.
Wow,
as the diamond in the heavens, because it reflected so much sunlight, because it was literally 4 to 5 times larger than the planet Earth, and you can imagine it glinting like a diamond, even in the sunlight, and quite beautiful, really.
I remember just going back to the moon. I remember when I was a kid, looking at the Daily Sport, and for anyone that doesn't know, the Daily Sport is a silly paper in the UK that shows comedic stories, ridiculous. And one of the stories on the front cover was a Spitfire that landed on the moon, and actually it was crashed into the moon. And I just always remember it as a child. And then obviously the research we've done and finding out about the socialist, National Socialist Germany, Germans that actually went up there, apparently created a space fleet, right? So they created.
I think so. I think you're right. Yeah, from what is known, or what is purportedly known about the Third Reich and National Socialist Germany, was the Kriegsmarine, which means in the English language warfare navy, created unofficially. I mean, this is, again, it's open to speculation, what became known as the Viertes Reich Raumflotte, or the Fourth Empire Space Fleet. And apparently it was actually the Kriegsmarine, or the warfare navy, and this Viertes Reich Raumflotte, or Fourth Empire Space Fleet of National Socialist Germany, that managed to land some kind of spaceship on the surface of the moon around the 23rd of August 1942, and it apparently landed in the Mare Imbrium, within the Imbrium Basin on the moon.
Wow.
Which is interesting to note. And we have to also remember that a very crude initial photograph of the surface of the moon was also sent back by the Lunar 3, or E2A number 1 space probe that had been put into orbit around the moon by the Soviet Union of Communist Russia on the 18th of October 1959. So even back then, the Soviet Russians were actively wanting to really push ahead with their own Soviet Russian space program, because they wanted to gain dominance on the moon. Now, we can speculate really all day about whether there was some kind of Fourth Reich, National Socialists on the dark side of the moon. Were they in some kind of covert alliance as part of a secret space program, SSP, with ultra-terrestrials, extraterrestrials, or not? Nobody actually knows the ins and outs of those nuances. And again, it's just open to speculation. But what we do know is that obviously, going to look at the Apollo lunar program, it appears as though the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was warned off going back to the moon by what appeared to be certain kinds of ultra-terrestrials or extraterrestrials. And we have to also remember that Ingo Swann, one of the greatest scientific remote viewers of all time, and the man was an absolute genius, was part of, obviously, a scientific remote viewing program that was carried out between the United States Army and the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. So again, you've got all this vast amounts of data and information that really indicate that the moon wasn't always in orbit around planet Earth.
Yeah,
it's absolutely covered with artificial structures. It's been excavated out. So it's obviously some kind of heavily adapted artificial spherical body, but originally it would have been a natural spherical body. Perhaps it wasn't even from this solar system originally. Maybe it was actually navigated here on a singularity from some other location many light years elsewhere in the Milky Way galaxy. And again, that's all open to speculation. Perhaps scientific remote viewing, or SRV, or natural remote viewing, or NRV, could be used to verify that. We know, for example, that Ingo Swann, like Russell Targ, and many other individuals like Paul Elder have done extensive scientific remote viewing, or SRV, when it comes to the moon, that has confirmed that it is a lot more than it seems, than we're being told by certain academics from Western science. It's a very unusual spherical body in orbit around planet Earth, and it whatever we believe it is not.
Yeah, certainly is, and it's a mystery, and it's been a mystery for a long time. And I think we are coming to a closure on that. We are coming to a point,
yeah.
And I feel there's no other direction that we can go but releasing and putting this information out into the public. There is so much around the moon anomalies and all the situations happening on the moon, all the stuff we've looked into, and there is a lot more that goes on. But obviously, you can't really, you have to speculate on certain things because it's a very hard thing to, kind of actually prove, because we're not on the moon. But actually, what I was thinking when we were discussing this is how much we have learned and how much information we do have. I mean, once you look into it, if you choose to look into it, that is. But Stephen, that was absolutely beautiful as always. Really well put and articulated to people. Thank you for clarifying that as well to people. This is all information that people can research themselves and look into. We only touch the surface with a lot of this, so this does go a lot deeper.
Yeah.
And it's all publicly available if you choose to look into it. But I'd say that's the problem we have, is a lot of people don't look into things. No. And they're given things with face value, and then they just swallow the story. But Stephen, thank you very much, my brother. So there is a chapter in our book Luminous Worlds called Lunar Anomalies, which covers a lot of information that we've covered in the Moon podcast. But we have recently released our book Vanished Kingdoms, which is a book on Tartaria, and that is available on Amazon in paperback, hardback, and an ebook will be coming very soon. Thank you, Stephen. That's absolutely beautiful, and it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.